heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 214, covering the week of April 20th through April 24th, 2020. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute. Like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. You're going to want to get that. And of course, you will get our Daily Dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. Also, get your free Abbeville Institute mobile app. Just go to your app store, look for Abbeville Institute, and download the app. Again, free of charge. You get access to this podcast. You also get access to all of our lectures and mobile access to the website. So it's a great way to keep up with the Institute on the go. You can also support the Institute by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. Click on that support tab at the top of the page. You'll have donor options. Click on that. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. That's the way that we continue our operations here at the Institute. So if you like the podcast, you like our articles, our website, you like the conferences, which are on pause right now because of COVID-19, but they will come back, and we're talking about some other ways to do some things. So that's still out there. So we haven't given up on conferences. But if you like all that stuff, you can consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. So please do that as well. Also get your Abbeville Institute apparel. Just click on that shop tab under support. You can get your Abbeville Institute shirts, hats, towels, fleece, embroidered high-quality stuff. So you're going to want to get all these ways to support the Institute. And of course, share our material around on social media. Rate our podcast. Do all the things you can do to help get more eyeballs on our material, because that's the way we're going to help save and defend and explore the Southern tradition in America. All right, so let's talk about the topics for the week. We had a lot of good stuff this week, and I think the primary focus for this particular week was John C. Calhoun and the Southern tradition, which it always is, but in a way that is important, and that is, what does it mean to be a Southern man in the 21st century in relation to the topic from, say, the 19th century, or even earlier than that? I mean, where does this quintessential Southern man come from, and where does this culture come from? I mean, are we going even into the, say, 17th or 18th century for that, before we had the United States, before we had the American War for Independence? Where do we find this Southern culture? And I think so I'm going to actually start with the poems for the week. And the cultural stuff we did at the end of the week. Of course, we're running our series now on Southern music and also Southern poets and poetry. So these are going to be long-standing series. It's probably going to take us several weeks to get through this stuff. But I do want to start with this and looking at William Byrd II. Now, William Byrd II has become much more popular in, say, the last 20 years because of his diaries. And even before that, I mean, people had read his diary, his secret diary and history of the dividing line. But I think that David Hackett Fisher and his Albion Sea did a really good job of exploring Cavalier culture through Byrd's diaries. And so we have to understand who William Byrd was and why William Byrd was important. And when you look at his own epitaph or his tomb at Westover Plantation, first of all, Westover Plantation still stands. It's a beautiful home. It's privately owned, I believe. And it is the symmetrical brick structure that the Cavalier culture was well known for producing. It's a beautiful home, right on the James River. It's in Charles City County, Virginia. But when you look at what his epitaph says, and you look at what he was very proud of being, first of all, it was his education. It was his station in society. It was his admission to the Royal Society. I mean, this is a man who really believed in the old English country order. And that is one of the keys to understanding the Southern tradition, at least part of it. Because Byrd was not a man of the frontier, he was a man of the tidewater. And the frontier turned a little different, but of course, as important in developing Southern culture as did the tidewater. But when you look at the tidewater of Virginia, and you look at the intellectual muscle that came from that particular region of the state, the colony and then the state, I mean, it's a really important thing to understand when you look at Cavalier culture. And there's a wonderful book by Lewis Wright, The First Gentleman of Virginia, and it gets into Byrd and others, but certainly it explores this intellectual part of Southern society and how important that is, even to this day when you look at Southern culture and what comprises Southern culture, whether it's the Cavalier culture from the Tidewater region, which filtered down into the Carolinas, and or it's the borderlands part of Southern society, which is Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun. How important that part was. And of course, even when you look at Virginia society and the conflicts between the Tidewater region and the frontier region of the state, and how important that was moving forward. I mean, look, the Constitutional Convention in Virginia in the 1820s is one of the most important episodes in American history because it wrestled with every major issue that was coming up in the 19th century, primarily the expansion of suffrage and what that was going to do to American society. I mean, we're still wrestling with this issue today. You have one faction of the American electorate that believes, or at least those in power believe, that everyone should vote 10 times. I mean, it's even if you're dead, you should vote. Expanding the suffrage helps them. And then you have some distrust of that. I don't think necessarily opposition, but some distrust of expansion of suffrage on the other side. And of course, anytime you talk about restricting suffrage, you're going to be called all kinds of names. But this was going on in the 19th century. In a way that had been going on in other parts of the world. As we start wrestling with this idea of democracy, well, where do we stop with democracy? And of course, when you look at someone like William Byrd, who would not have been behind democracy at all, and you look at some of the men in Virginia who were very critical and suspicious of expanding democracy because they saw in it real problems. John Randolph of Roanoke, for example, which is, when you look at his time in government, and of course, at one point, perhaps an alliance with Andrew Jackson, who we have a review of, another review of Brad Berzer's book. And I think the reason that we published this one when we'd already reviewed Brad Berzer's book in defense of Andrew Jackson, because this is much more thorough, and this piece could have been titled In Defense of Calhoun, because James Rutledge Roach, who wrote the review, spent a lot of time talking about Calhoun, which is good because Calhoun was an important figure in that particular period of time as well. So I really like this particular focus on William Byrd and, of course, Ebenezer Cook, who had just some really funny stuff to say about Quakers. And Quaker culture is really very much unknown in American society now, but it is a very important part of American culture. I mean, moving forward, and how important it was in particularly the 18th, late 17th, early 18th century in Pennsylvania. And of course, as Pennsylvania was the hub of the United States for a time, it infiltrated other parts of American society. But when you go back and you look at what some Southerners had to say about Quaker culture, they weren't too kind to it. They considered a lot of Quakers to be frauds. And even in the American War for Independence, I mean, look, Quakers were denounced as being fence sitters, not really taking part in the activity. So Quakers, they reveled in persecution, but there was certainly some poking fun at Quakers for being inconsistent adherents to their own religious doctrines. But, so these two poems, particularly William Byrd's look at Virginia society in the 18th century, early 18th century, late 17th century, is important. And then, of course, the music that we put out on Friday, some of these songs that we had there. And I mean, look, there's no better expression in the COVID era than Charlie Daniels' Long-Haired Country Boy. It is a wonderful song, one of the best that's ever been written in the South and, of course, in Southern rock. But when you look at the pieces that we selected for this week, the songs, I should say, Long-Haired Country Boy and Flirting with Disaster from Molly Hatchet. I mean, it seems like that's what we're doing now. We're all flirting with disaster. The economy's flirting with disaster. The political process is flirting with disaster. I mean, what are we doing? Toy Caldwell's I Hear the South Calling Me. Of course, Toy Caldwell, this is his solo work from Marshall Tucker. And, of course, we did have a Marshall Tucker song, Fire on the Mountain, which was expansion, right? I mean, this idea of the frontier going west and what that meant. So a lot of good stuff here. Some upbeat pieces like 38 Specials, Rockin' Into the Night, and the Ozark Mountain Daredevils, If You Want to Get to Heaven, or Little Feat's Let It Roll. There's some great stuff. And even the South Calling Me, or Cadillac 3's The South. I mean, this is fun stuff, but then we have this much more serious tone to it, playful, serious tone in Long-Haired Country Boy, Train by Blackfoot, which is actually written by Ricky Metlock's grandfather, Shorty. Molly Hatchet's piece. So, good stuff here. Good stuff. Steel Woods, which we featured on a piece at the Institute. I wrote a piece about them several weeks ago, but Straw in the Wind, which is just a fantastic, I think, instant classic for the South. And has that frontier feel to it, just like Fire on the Mountain does. And it's why we put those two together. But great stuff. And thinking about, Let It Roll, and then Delaney and Bonnie, Living on the Open Road, Train, this idea of mobility in the South and how important that frontier was in Southern history. And so, saying that, let's talk about the frontier with Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, and then we'll wrap up with Boyd Cathey's discussion of Chronicles magazine and why he suggested everyone should get that magazine in the South. But let's look at the frontier and John C. Calhoun. So the piece on Monday we had by John Grove. John Grove is now an important figure at Law and Liberty, which is the Liberty Fund's online publication. And he's written a very good book on John C. Calhoun, John C. Calhoun's theory of republicanism. And what he has done here is trying to separate the question of slavery with Calhoun and Calhoun's political philosophy. Now, this is not something that most people are willing to do, and in fact, I think Grove has taken a very bold stand here in publicly doing this. I mean, if you're going to pick someone to write about from the 19th century that everyone hates, it's John C. Calhoun, and you're going to do it in a positive way, you're doing something that's very important. Clyde Wilson did it throughout his entire career at University of South Carolina. But when you look at John C. Calhoun and what I think James Roche has done with his piece on Brad Berzer's In Defense of Andrew Jackson, Brad Berzer embodies what you have for many people on the right. A begrudging respect of John C. Calhoun's political philosophy, but the consistent choice to denounce John C. Calhoun as a man, and particularly to focus on Calhoun's views on slavery. What John Grove has done is to separate those two things and say, look, we need to focus on John C. Calhoun, the political philosopher, and in reality forget about this stuff on slavery. Why? Because he made a statement at the end of the piece, which we didn't publish the entire piece on our website. You have to go and finish it at Law and Liberty, which is fine. I mean, it's to drive traffic to their site too. That's a good site. As he says at the end of the piece, look, Calhoun's views on race and slavery were not even unique or novel. I mean, this is the part of his political philosophy that isn't really that important at the end of the day, because other people were saying the same things and had been saying the same things by the time John C. Calhoun started saying these things for well over 100 years in America. The first pro-slavery treatise in America was written by a New England theologian, John Saffin, in 1701. And of course, Calhoun went to Yale, where he digested much of this pro-slavery ideology from New England theologians who were defending it at that particular point because abolitionism had taken hold in parts of New England, and these New England theologians were having to combat this rise of abolitionism in New England. And so Calhoun simply echoed what these theologians had been saying for well over 100 years by the time he made his speeches on, say, the positive good or the Oregon Bill, or whatever the case may be, and where he is defending the institution of slavery, an institution he inherited and, of course, defended. But his positions on slavery itself as a positive good were not any different than what had been said for a long period of time in America about the institution in various sectors. He didn't invent that. He didn't come up with it. However, he did come up with the concurrent majority. That was all John C. Calhoun. And in fact, people have studied this concurrent majority all over the world. So when you look at Calhoun's lasting legacy, it's not the positive good, it's the concurrent majority. It's his views on constitutionalism, as John Grove points out in this particular piece, that are the most important part of the Calhoun legacy in America. Now, you could point back to saying that, well, that's Jefferson and Madison, but Calhoun had his own views on the Constitution and how it should work. And if you go back and you read Calhoun carefully, which, Clyde Wilson produced a wonderful collection of Calhoun's writings, The Essential Calhoun, which, and Lee Cheek, of course, did this. And also Ross Lentz, The Political Philosophy of John C. Calhoun, or at least his Union and Liberty, which is, Ross Lentz. It's 1992. That's the subtitle of that book, Union and Liberty, The Political Philosophy of John C. Calhoun. When you look at that particular collection, I think when you look at these three collections, Lentz's, Cheek's, and Wilson's, you find Calhoun to be an important prophet in American history. This is why when Clyde and I sat down and we started talking about the title for the book that we wrote together, Forgotten Conservatives in American History, we initially looked at forgotten prophets in American history. And Calhoun, of course, being foremost among them. And, of course, Clyde Wilson wrote the chapter on Calhoun in that particular book. But when you go back and you look at what Calhoun had to say about politics in the 19th century, and you look at politics today, you wonder why this man has been swept under the rug. And, of course, he's been swept under the rug because he offers the only substantial criticism of American stupidity in the 19th century. Jefferson was dead in 1826. The old Republicans had died out not long after that, and Calhoun was left. Now, the old Republicans did not trust John C. Calhoun because they considered him to be too much of a nationalist when he was a youngster. They thought that Calhoun wasn't sincere. But see, this is the important thing to note about John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was actually consistent throughout his entire life as an advocate for the Union. But it was a particular type of Union and a particular type of nationalism. John C. Calhoun was always a nationalist. But he was a nationalist in a way that would say that the Union was important as long as it was beneficial to all and burdened all. This is what he always said. So he was a real American nationalist, not a sectionalist like you would find in Daniel Webster. You see, Daniel Webster is often called a nationalist, but Daniel Webster was no nationalist. Daniel Webster was a New England sectionalist. It's clear from the time he entered Congress. This is what Daniel Webster was all about. Daniel Webster advocated whatever was best for his constituents in New England. If it was free trade in 1812, that's what he was for. The War of 1812 certainly damaged New England shipping. And so Daniel Webster was a nullification/secessionist in 1812. But when it came time in the 1830s, 1820s and 30s to talk about tariffs, and now the protective tariff was helping the growing industrial sector of New England, well, then he became a protectionist. And of course, that was characterized as nationalism, but really what it was is New England sectionalism. Whereas John C. Calhoun in 1816 advocated a tariff as a bone to New England for the abuse that they suffered during the War of 1812. He was trying to make amends and saying, look, this is good for the entire United States. And this is what Calhoun always said when they asked, well, how can you oppose the tariff of 1828? How can you oppose the tariff of 1832? He's inconsistent. Calhoun's duplicitous. Calhoun can't be trusted. Calhoun would say, no, I'm doing the exact same thing. The tariff of 1816 is much different from 1828 or 32. Why? Because those are massively protective measures which are not in line with what I was advocating in 1816. So Calhoun was always consistent, and his consistency was that he distrusted power, unlimited power, and the central authority. He understood that factionalism, just as Washington did, would be dangerous because when the party's out of power, they're going to snipe and cite the Constitution. When they get in power, they don't care about it. And this is something he wrote extensively about. He was always a Republican with a lowercase r. And this is what John Grove points out. He was always a Republican. Of course, to write something positive about Calhoun now is almost career suicide, which is why Grove is working for Liberty Fund. You're not going to get a tenured track position at a university if universities even continue to exist because of COVID-19. I mean, there's a lot of discussions about what universities are going to look like in the future. Students are figuring out very quickly, and parents are too, wait, we don't need to spend $50,000 a year when we can just do the stuff at home. And I mean, who needs to go on campus? And when you can have recorded lectures and other things, I mean, who needs to go there? This is going to change everything, I think, and in a good way. I think it's going to be a positive for students and the use of technology and what we can do with it. But when you look at Calhoun and you write something positive about Calhoun, you're not going to get those positions. And so John Grove, I think, took a great career risk. Of course, I think it landed him in a good spot and being positive about John C. Calhoun. He has the obligatory, Calhoun's, he says these things, these are bad, these are odious, these are awful. I mean, you almost have to use that rhetoric now, that type of language today, just to have anything written about Calhoun. And my question is, why would you even put that in there to begin with? If you want to talk about his politics, just leave the other stuff out. And I mean, we don't say this about Aristotle. We don't say, Aristotle's a brilliant man, but he had odious things to say about race and about slavery and other things. We don't say that. We just talk about Aristotle. So why do we have to do it about Calhoun all the time? Well, because we live in a SJWPC society that almost demands this if you're going to write anything about someone who might have a view that's out of line with a very narrow, acceptable opinion in American society. So and I love this piece because he gets into the weeds here about, how Calhoun responded to some things about his views on government. Would it paralyze society? He said absolutely not. In fact, it would save the Union. Nullification would save the Union. And it did. Nullification saved the Union more than anything else. Even the mere threat of a state saying, you know what, we're going to nullify that. That would actually be a break on secession, because Nathaniel Macon said, look, nullification is stupid, just secede. I mean, he was looking at nullification as what it was, a way to save the Union, but a way to save the Union that would, in his mind, just render the Union useless. So just leave the Union. Whereas Calhoun thought, no, nullification would save the original Union. Because if the states can operate the way they should be operating in this particular government, as a hedge against these unconstitutional acts, then we're good. I mean, this is not going to destroy the Union then. So you've got this wonderful piece by John Grove. You should definitely read it. And then, of course, we had the piece by James Roche on in defense of Andrew Jackson, the book review of that. And his comments on Calhoun and showing where Brad Berzer... Now, Brad Berzer, as he points out, did a great job in being objective with John C. Calhoun's political philosophy. I mean, Brad Berzer doesn't like John C. Calhoun as a person, as a man, and his views, but he does at least respect Calhoun as a political thinker, in contrast to Annette Gordon Reed, who called Calhoun a second-rate statesman. I mean, what a stupid statement. This was in, as Roche said, he went to the Hermitage, Jackson's home, and watched the video. And, of course, you had Annette Gordon Reed in this video call Calhoun a second-rate American statesman. Why anyone would read Annette Gordon Reed is beyond me. She is an historian with a pure axe to grind. And, of course, very biased. Now, all historians are biased. But if you know what her biases are, you'll just avoid reading her. I mean, she's not even a very good historian. She's taken things out of context and done some horrible things with her topics, her subjects. But regardless, I think that this review of Brad Berzer's book, which he points out some of the flaws in the book. There are good parts of the book. He does say, look, there are good things in the book. I think that he places Jackson in the proper context. The frontier, the southern frontier, and of course Calhoun being from that too, and how important that was in Southern society, and Jackson's alliance with the old Republicans, people like John Randolph, people like Nathaniel Macon, his alliance with these individuals. He wasn't a purist like them. He wasn't someone who believed in the original Union like them. I mean, Jackson was a much more aggressive nationalist, and of course I've written about Jackson in a couple of different places. One in my Politically Incorrect Guide to Real American Heroes, where I do call Jackson an American hero. Whereas in my 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America, I call Jackson a president who screwed up America. And so you can have both with Jackson. I mean, look, Jackson was an American hero. His operations during the Creek War, the Seminole War, the War of 1812, I mean, these are important parts of the Andrew Jackson legacy, and that we should not overlook, and how important he was for establishing this young federal republic and helping move that forward. On the other hand, when Jackson becomes president, he's highly problematic because he accepts this unbridled nationalism, which later Lincoln will capitalize on in his actions against the South in 1861. You can't get Abraham Lincoln without Andrew Jackson. And Lincoln, of course, is from the southern frontier. I mean, he was born in Kentucky. And this is why Lincoln was actually chosen by the Republicans in 1860. They thought he could pull some of these southern frontier votes away from the Democrats. But, you know, when speaking of how Roche describes this relationship between Jackson and Calhoun and what Berzer says about it, I mean, Berzer takes the very standard boilerplate interpretation of Calhoun that he's not a good guy, he's duplicitous, and I think James Roche takes him apart on that. I mean, he does a fantastic job of ripping that whole position apart. And so last but not least, we have this article by Boyd Cathy on Chronicles magazine. And the image we used on the website was one of the most recent covers of Chronicles. And it has a piece on there by Jack Trotter talking about, William Buckley. And people, well, I'm not going to read anything with William Buckley on it. Let me tell you something. Jack Trotter is pure Abbeville Institute. I mean, his talks at the last summer school were fantastic. He's written for us before. He is rock solid. And Chronicles, under now the direction of Paul Gottfried, has published some things that, look, when Aaron Wolfe was alive, they published this type of material as well. And Aaron Wolfe actually spoke at an Abbeville Institute conference. I mean, Aaron Wolfe, great, and unfortunately died far too young and far too soon. But you have Paul Gottfried continuing this, and Boyd Cathy points out this is some really good stuff. And he points to my articles on Reconstruction in a couple of issues ago, some other things in defense of Robert Louis Dabney. I mean, there are some things that Chronicles is doing now that are just fantastic. And I think that if you want to get a print magazine, which print magazines are wonderful, you want to get a print magazine that is doing a very good job of keeping the Southern tradition alive in print, well, then get Chronicles. We have the Abbeville Institute, which is not a print publication, but get this print magazine. It's fantastic. And of course, Clyde Wilson for years wrote in Chronicles and continues to do so. So it is, the subtitle is A Magazine of American Culture. Tom Fleming, who is, of course, a friend of the Abbeville Institute, was for years the editor of Chronicles magazine. Still has his Fleming Foundation. We also, here at the Abbeville Institute, recommend the Fleming Foundation. It's fantastic. So all of these, we're all working together for the same thing, and that is to keep this very important part of American culture alive, and that's the South. This is the William Burroughs, John C. Calhoun, even in some ways Andrew Jackson. Look, Jackson, the military hero, some of that is to keep that alive. And I'll say this about Roche. He says at the end, look, he admires Southern leaders like Nathan Bedford Forrest and Thomas Stonewall Jackson and these people. He admires them as soldiers. He's not so certain they would make good political leaders, but he admires them for what they had to do at the time they had to do it. And I think that's the important distinction to make between Jackson, the man, the general, and Jackson, the president. It's not to say that Jackson wasn't an important American and a vital American, but Jackson as president was problematic. And we should always look at that as we evaluate the character and career of these individuals. So, you got to love John C. Calhoun. I'll finish with that. An important part of the Southern tradition. His political philosophy is brilliant. And I think that's where we need to look at Calhoun, the man. All right. Until next time, good day.